David Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, an extremely important and influential book. Here I will not attempt to give a proper summary of the book or commentary on the whole text, just a few pointers on some of the interesting things that happen in the middle of the book. These are the reflections that Kant later tells us first awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. In part 4 of the book, Hume gives us some skeptical doubts concerning the operations of the understanding, as he puts it. He begins with 2 paragraphs that are extremely important, some of the most important paragraphs ever written in philosophy. He defines in these paragraphs all of our human knowledge as falling into one of 2 categories. The first category is the relations of ideas, including the truths of mathematics and geometry, for example. Relations of ideas, Hume tells us, are 100% certain. Their probability is 100%. And, he tells us, relations of ideas are known independently of experience. In the philosophical terminology, we say they are known a posteriori. Relations of ideas, note well, do not tell us anything about the way the world outside the mind works. What they do is they tell us how our minds work. They are really nothing but relations of our ideas. The notion, the principle that 2 + 2 = 4 is true, not because of anything in the world outside the mind, but because our minds inevitably relate the idea of 2 + 2 to the idea of 4. The second category of knowledge is the category of knowledge about things outside the mind. These are the matters of fact, as Hume calls it. Relations of ideas first, second, matters of fact. Matters of fact are known from experience, a posteriori, not a priori. And matters of fact are inherently uncertain. It is always possible that future experience will turn up evidence against them. And they do describe knowledge of the world outside. They do give us, rather, they are knowledge of the world outside the mind. Or are they? Here, a skeptical doubt emerges, as Hume puts it. It is not immediately apparent to most people what this skeptical doubt is, but to a philosopher like Hume, it quickly becomes apparent. He has just told us that all our knowledge of the world outside the mind derives from experience, all of it. Now, this leads to a skeptical doubt if it can be shown that knowledge from experience, or empirical knowledge, has a foundation. Is there any principle on which empirical knowledge depends? And if that principle cannot be shown, if there is such a principle, and if it can be shown that that principle does not itself come to us from experience, then there is no empirical knowledge. And that is the skeptical doubt. Lest it be left unclear, I will attempt to phrase it again. If all of our knowledge of the world outside the mind comes from experience, and if knowledge from experience depends on any principle which cannot itself be learned from experience, then there can be no knowledge of the world outside the mind. This is the skeptical doubt Hume raises, because he thinks knowledge of the world outside the mind, empirical knowledge, knowledge from experience, does have a foundation. There is at least one principle on which knowledge from experience depends. Well, what is that principle? This will all be for nothing if he doesn't tell us what the principle is. He first looks at one option, causality, the principle that cause and effect exists, that one event really does cause another. Hume actually does not treat this as the foundation of all our empirical knowledge. It is the foundation of most of it, but it itself has a basis. More precisely, it is the basis of most of our empirical knowledge, but it itself rests on a foundation. It is known from experience. There is something else underlying it, which is not known from experience, but is necessary to know causality and everything else we know from experience. Or, in fact, there are 2. One of them is the uniformity of nature. This is the principle that the same laws of physics are always in place. At all times, in all places, things happen in the same way. The second is the principle of induction. This is the principle that tells us that we can reason about things we have not experienced from what we have experienced. Or we can learn about what we have not experienced from what we have experienced. For example, we might observe that in our past experience, unhindered objects always fall towards the center of the earth. And then we conclude that all unhindered objects will fall towards the center of the earth, at least all objects on earth. Perhaps in space, they will proceed towards the nearest large mass, but on the surface of the earth, they all proceed towards the center of the earth. We make this conclusion based on past experience, but we haven't tested all falling objects. We haven't tested all unhindered objects. We're concluding things about all unhindered objects on the surface of the earth from only some of them. We make that conclusion by the principle of induction. Now, on what does the principle of induction depend? How do we know that it is true? On what does the uniformity of nature depend? How do we know that it is true? If you look at the principle of induction, you might reason for it in this way. You might say, it's worked well in the past, it's served us well, it seems to have given us reliable knowledge before, so it will again. It always does, because it has done so before. In our experience, induction works, therefore induction can be trusted. Well, the conclusion concerns uses of the principle of induction that we have not yet made. In other words, we're using the principle of induction to prove the principle of induction, if we reason in this way. We're reasoning about times when we have used the principle of induction, and it has worked in our experience, to conclude things about uses of the principle of induction that we have not experienced. And this is circular reasoning and a logical fallacy. We can't do that. What can we do? We can reason for the principle of induction from the uniformity of nature. We can conclude that the same laws of physics are always in operation. Therefore, we can reason about how they will work in situations we have not experienced from situations where we have experienced them. Or we could go the other direction. We could reason about the uniformity of nature from the principle of induction. We could say we can know how things work where we have not experienced them, and we can know this by induction, and we can conclude that probably they work in the same ways because there is a uniformity to nature, because the same rules of physics are always in operation. Well, that's fine, but what's the foundation for knowledge here? At least one of these principles, it seems, is going to have to be serving as the basis of the other. And what is the basis of it? Now, I'm not saying that there can be no answer given. In fact, in response to Hume, Immanuel Kant and Thomas Reid and other philosophers have suggested that there can be an explanation given. Actually, if you study the works of Kant and Reid and their responses to Hume, you'll find that what they really reject is those first two paragraphs where he defines all knowledge of the world outside the mind as deriving purely from experience. But Hume doesn't do this. Hume does not have an answer. Or does he? Well, he doesn't have an answer regarding knowledge. He gives us these skeptical doubts in part 4. And then in part 5 of the Enquiry, he gives us what he calls a skeptical solution to the doubts. And if I understand him correctly, it's a skeptical solution because it's not a solution that explains how we have knowledge. But it is a solution because it tells us why we should go ahead and keep believing these things. Keep reasoning from experience. Keep doing science. Keep believing in the principles of induction, causality, and uniformity of nature. And why should we believe in them? Because we do, and we do it by custom. Or we do it by habit. It's not very easy to say exactly what the basis is here. The basis is a sort of practical basis. Hume dabbles in psychology here. He says we instinctively believe in these things. We believe by custom. We believe by habit, he tells us. And though I don't recall him using the word, I think what he really means is we believe by instinct. We instinctively believe in the principle of the uniformity of nature and in the principle of induction. And we believe in causality because of them. And because of all three of those, we believe that we can get knowledge of the world outside the mind from experience. And this is the natural and proper way for human beings to live, by believing in this way. And we should keep doing it. That is his skeptical solution. But he is not, if I understand him correctly, prepared to say that we have knowledge. As far as Hume goes, the skeptical doubts remain.